Topic Notes 3.1, Marine Ecology. So today we're going to build on some of the knowledge that you've gained through other courses like biology and apply your knowledge about ecology into the marine environment. This is a picture from the Florida Keys. In it you have a blue tang, which is the fish in the middle there on the right. And you also see a lot of other organisms, everything from soft corals to algae, and there's a little damselfish in the background. You also have rock and water. And that's really what we're talking about, the interaction between all of these living organisms and the abiotic environment around them. So the main idea today, what we're really focusing on, is again what ecology really is. And it is that interaction between organisms within various different communities and their relationships with the abiotic environment. And as always, remember to review the learning goals and remember that they are reflected on your scales that I will be providing you in class as well. If you break the word ecology down from the Greek, oikos meaning house or dwelling, and logos meaning discourse. So loosely interpreted, it's a house full of discourse. The study of ecology centers on the relationship between organisms and each other and the physical environment that they're in. Most specifically, we tend to be dealing a lot with abundance and distribution of various populations and why they're distributed in various different ways. To give you an example, this is a jawfish, and jawfish are found throughout the world. The particular species you're looking at here is found in the Lake Worth Lagoon. This picture is from the Lake Worth Lagoon, and so is the video. Watch for a moment and see what this jawfish is doing. So how was this jawfish interacting with its environment? If you said that it was manipulating shells and gravel and sand and substrate to make itself a home, you would be correct. So are all of those things that it was manipulating living? Not really. The sand and sediment were never living. The shells are non-living. They were produced by a living organism. And of course, it relies on those shells to help build that enclosure and keep the sand from falling down into its tube. The jawfish will also hunt for small invertebrates around its home. And so it's interacting with lots of different species, both dead and alive, and it's interacting with its abiotic or non-living environment. Now we need to define the terms biotic and abiotic factors. Now, bio you know from the term biology or life, the study of life. And that's exactly what we're looking at. We're talking about living components of the ecosystem. Abiotic, of course, is the opposite of that. It's the non-living physical and chemical components of the ecosystem. We'll actually be dealing with a lot about that in the first part of the year. We're talking about geologic features, substrate, temperature, sunlight, wave action, salinity, things like that. See if you can identify some of the biotic and abiotic components in the pictures in this slide. Now, the jawfish would be considered a species on the level of organization that we're going to look at within an ecosystem. Now, species is kind of the lowest rung because it's very specific, and species generally become a natural group of actually or potentially interbreeding individuals. So all of the little jawfish, and that one was a dusky jaw, in the area of the Lake Worth Lagoon consists of a population of those jawfish. Now, we've covered species and then the population, all of those in that area. Then we have the community level. And at the community level, we're talking about not only the jawfish, but also maybe the grunts or the tangs or the groupers or the snappers or the blue crabs or the conchs, all of those different populations within the Lake Worth Lagoon area. Now, if you add on the abiotic environment, the non-living components of the environment, then you have the ecosystem, because an ecosystem is the community with all those populations interacting, and that community interacting with non-living environment. Now, we mentioned the term ecosystem. The community interacting with the abiotic environment, the whole shebang. Now, we can look at ecosystems at a variety of scales. You could look at an ecosystem that exists in a drop of water. You could look at the entire ocean as one big ecosystem. Generally, however, we tend to group things in sort of easier to manage sections, and we'll do that when we say, okay, we'll talk about a coral reef ecosystem, or an estuary ecosystem, or a seagrass ecosystem, or a deep sea ecosystem, or an ocean ecosystem. So you'll often see us refer that way, but realize that there are definite your scope depends on your point of view in the study that you're doing. Now, of course, every ecosystem begins somewhere, and ecosystems have various components, and we're going to get into that now. First and foremost, everything starts with the sun. The sun provides the energy for pretty much every ecosystem on the planet. There is one exception, but we're going to get to that at another time. So the sun providing that energy needs to be converted into something useful. And of course, that process happens through photosynthesis, which I know you've studied before. So through that process of photosynthesis, they take that energy from the sun and they store it in chemical bonds within a molecule, specifically glucose. And that provides them food whenever they need it, energy for life processes. Heterotrophs, on the other hand, are consumers. They do not make their own food, so they have to actually consume other sources of energy. Now, when we're talking about primary consumers, they're directly feeding on autotrophs or producers. So that would be like an elk or deer grazing on grass in a meadow. In the ocean, most primary consumers feed on phytoplankton, because phytoplankton is the kind of most important primary producer in the ocean. Interestingly enough, what tends to feed on phytoplankton the most is actually other types of plankton called zooplankton, or animal-like plankton. Now, we're going to talk a lot more about plankton in another lecture, and you're going to have a whole lab on it, but just gives you an idea how the food chain works. Other important herbivores or primary consumers are some fish. Down below, you'll see a picture of what you all might recognize as Dory. Dory from Finding Nemo is actually a blue tang, specifically a Pacific blue tang. And tangs in general tend to feed on lots of algae and seagrasses and things like that. So you see them grazing a lot on the reefs that they live on. Now, of course, we couldn't look at an ecosystem components without talking about detritivores and specifically decomposers. What happens when animals die or they shed off skin or exoskeletons or whatever? You have organic matter that's not living. That's where these two components come in. Detritivores are going to be consuming detritus, and detritus is basically non-living organic matter, and it tends to collect on the seafloor through various means. And lots of organisms will pick on this stuff. Sea cucumbers basically will go up and hoover up all of the organic materials and consume it. Crabs tear things apart and consume things. All of that's great. So those are detritivores. Now, then we have the most important role, the decomposers. Now, these are what break down that organic matter and eventually will produce nutrients back into the environment that primary producers like plants, phytoplankton, things like that can then consume again and use. And the primary component for this would be bacteria and fungi. Same thing that happens on land. Bacteria break all that down in soil and release nutrients back into the soil for plants to soak up with their roots. And those nutrients tend to be phosphates and nitrates and things like that. And that allows photosynthesis to occur again. And so all of this stuff sort of keeps going round and around. In fact, we're going to have a whole discussion on cycles very soon, so stay tuned. This just gives you a preview. So now we're going to start putting things together, and we're going to talk about trophic structure. Now, if you notice the terms autotroph and heterotroph, you have that troph in there. Troph is Latin for food. That's why we call autotrophs self-feeders. So trophic structure basically refers to this arrangement of autotrophs and succeeding levels of heterotrophs. Basically, we're talking about a food chain here. We're just using terminology you may or may not be used to. So a primary producer is the first trophic level. That would be your phytoplankton in the ocean. Your second trophic level would be your primary consumers, those who consume phytoplankton. A lot of times in the ocean, that's zooplankton. Then you have your third trophic level, and so on and so forth, all the way up until your big-time carnivores like killer whale. So each successive level is called a trophic level. Now we can put all these things together into what we call a food chain, because if you think about it, in an ecosystem, you have all of these interactions going on, mostly revolving around food. So you have the phytoplankton that gets consumed by the zooplankton that gets consumed maybe by some smaller fish, and so on and so forth up the chain. So a food chain specifically represents one pathway in which energy, and that's really what we're tracking here, flows from the sun all the way up to the tertiary, top level consumers. That's a food chain. Now, the problem, of course, with a food chain is that it's very simplistic. Most fish, or organisms in general, eat more than one thing. So a food chain only represents one possible food item for each of those particular organisms. Now, if we flip over to a food web, that is going to show multiple possible pathways interconnected. So it's kind of like you take a bunch of food chains and then you stitch them together to create a food web. And generally the arrows are showing the energy flow, or you can track biomass depending on how it goes. But generally it's the energy flow, and the larger arrows are the longer arrows, and a lot of diagrams will often show larger energy components. So organisms, though, consume across these levels. So sometimes you might have a organism in a second level feeding on a third level or a first level. They can do both. So things can get a little hairy on that level. But food webs by far give us a much better idea of what's going on in an ecosystem. So I'm going to throw a couple of terms out to you. We're going to talk about habitats and niches. Habitat is something you've heard of before. It's basically a place in which an animal normally lives. Now, a niche is constantly confusing to people. And really, if you boil it down, a niche is an organism's role in the environment. It involves all of the interactions that they have. It involves where they live, how they live, everything. That's their niche. It's their job. It's their role in the community. For example, we have a water bird here that's going after crabs. Okay, so it lives in a marsh habitat. It feeds off of crab populations, so it's interacting with that population. Those are all aspects of its niche. You can establish a niche basically for every biological variable that affects a species. When you have niches that overlap, you generally have competition for similar resources. This can lead to separation of niches through spatial or temporal differences between species. Now we can look at niches in two ways: fundamental or realized niche. The fundamental niche would be the potential distribution of a particular species sans competition and predators. So without all that, where could they possibly spread out to just based on environmental conditions and limits of their abilities? The realized niche is, of course, what actually happens, because there is, of course, competition and predators and other factors that we're going to limit them. So to give you an example of that, we're going to talk about red mangroves. Now, red mangroves, which you see pictured here, are coastal trees that can deal with and handle salt water. We'll talk a lot about them a little later on in the year. Now, mangroves are found in different parts of the world, but we're just going to talk about Florida. Now, in Florida, they tend to exist kind of around central Florida down into South Florida. They also tend to only exist along coastal regions. So, in terms of their fundamental niche, they are limited by climate. When it gets too cold as you go farther up north, they tend to start to die off. And so that tends to be a threshold for them. However, these trees do not have to be in salt water. They can grow very happily around Lake Okeechobee, throughout the canals and swamps and wetlands and stuff, but they don't. And the reason why they don't is they don't compete well with all of those other freshwater species. So even though their fundamental niche might include freshwater zones within their climate range, they actually don't exist there. The realized niche takes into account the competition of cypress trees and pond apples and all these other things that will outcompete them for space. And thus, they stay where the salt water is because other species can't handle the salt water.
Now, as I mentioned in the beginning, with ecology, a lot of times we are dealing with the abundance and distribution of species. And in order to understand that, we generally look at population growth and how that connects to available resources. To calculate population growth for a particular area, it's actually relatively easy. You look at the birth rate, you look at the death rate, and you look at migration. Now, migration can be broken into two different types of migration. Migration with immigration with an I, which is basically where you have gains, where various different individuals are coming into your population, and immigration with an E, where you are losing and species or individuals are immigrating out of the area. Now, all of these factors can be affected by the availability of resources, which can change seasonally. It can change due to particular catastrophic events or changing climate, all these sorts of events. So now we'll focus in on population growth. And we'll start with something called exponential growth, which is generally rapid, unchecked population growth. One of the best and simplest examples of this is bacteria. In a lab, if you take a petri dish with nutrient agar at the bottom and you inoculate it with bacteria, you're going to see exponential growth over the course of literally hours. Now in the graph here, you'll see time in hours on the x-axis and the number of bacteria in the thousands on the y-axis. Notice that the trend starts really slow. And if you look on the table on the right, you'll see this numerically. At hour 0, you have 1 bacteria, or maybe 1,000 really, as it's represented. And every half hour, you see you've got 2, 1 hour you have 4, hour and a half you have 8. This number starts to increase exponentially. Over the course of 10 hours, you end up with over 1 million bacteria. And this results in what you see on the graph as a J curve, a J population curve. Oddly enough, if you actually took the human population over the last several hundred years, you would also see a similar pattern. Now, the reason for this exponential growth, this J curve, is that there are plenty of resources in that petri dish. But of course, all good things must come to an end because that petri dish is limited, and eventually the bacteria will use up all of the nutrients available. At that point, you're going to have a population crash. And generally in nature, we tend to see a lot of this, what we tend to call a boom or bust sort of scenario, where you have populations increase and then populations decrease, usually in response to some sort of available resource or even a predator or a prey relationship. In this picture, you can see a ton of sea urchins, and they're all eating the bases of the kelp. And this would be an example of a population that is increasing. But once the kelp is gone, you'll see the population of sea urchins drop, and then kelp will start to rebuild. Now, most of the time in nature, we don't tend to see these huge swings. we tend to have what we call logistic growth, where population rates decrease as they approach that maximum size possible based on the limited resources. We tend to call that environmental resistance, and that tends to result in what we call an S curve in the population graph, where you have that initial, if you're coming into a new area, you might have that initial J curve, but once it starts to approach that carrying capacity, that population is going to level out around that line, and it may wobble back and forth, a little bit up, a little bit down, but generally the environmental resistance will keep it right about there at some sort of equilibrium. Now, any disturbance within the environment might change that equilibrium, and thus you will see a change in that population growth graph. It may be something like natural, like a hurricane coming through that might cause damage to a particular environment, or it could be a man-made cause, or it could be a new predator coming into an area. These things can all destabilize an equilibrium, and then the environment will tend to find another equilibrium over time.
All right, it's time to throw it back to you. Here's your in-depth question. How does the abiotic environment influence or change biotic components such as populations and communities? So I'll leave it up to you to think about, and make sure that you finalize and complete your summary notes. Until next time, keep thinking.